Today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday.
The United States and Europe respond to Russia's actions against Ukraine. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. On Monday, Russia recognized two regions of Ukraine as independent states. Today, Europe and the United States hit Russia with an opening round of sanctions for what they called a flagrant violation of international law. Tensions had been rising for weeks as Moscow sought a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO, while the West expressed concern over Russia's threats against a sovereign state. CGTN's Guy Henderson has more in this report from Kiev.
Earlier on Tuesday, we spoke to Mikhailo Podolyak, who is an aide who reports directly to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The first thing we asked him was for clarity on exactly under which circumstances Ukraine's army would engage advancing Russian military personnel. Not, he said, when more Russian troops entered separatist-controlled areas of Ukraine. Neither, if at all possible, he said, if fired upon by Russian troops along the contact line. But he did say that there would be a point at which Ukrainian forces would fight back.
Of course, the Ukrainian army will not conduct any offensive operations. Of course, we will defend ourselves if Russia tries to occupy Ukrainian government-held territory.
Podolyak also said that he did not see a full-scale invasion of Ukraine as likely because, he argued, that would be too costly in Russian lives and therefore very costly politically for Vladimir Putin back home in Russia. But neither did he say that moves like the German decision to put a halt on the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 would, in his view, shift significantly Vladimir Putin's thinking. His view was that the only way to force Vladimir Putin back to the negotiating table as an option, instead of taking further military action, was to take very harsh measures and bring down very harsh sanctions. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Kiev.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Aaron Maté is the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. And Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Anton, let me start with you. Of course, a lot has happened over the past 24 hours. President Putin signed those decrees recognizing those two regions in eastern Ukraine as independent republics. He also made a very long address from the Kremlin on Monday. What do you make of what has happened over the past 24 hours?
Well, I have to admit that I thought that the Russians would give the West longer before they moved towards recognition, which is, of course, exactly what they did yesterday. I thought there would be another week or maybe even two of diplomacy, but for reasons that are apparent only to the Kremlin, they decided to move ahead. And it seems that when you take the emotions out of it, which is very difficult to do, I agree, right now, that Putin has taken the path of least military risk. In other words, there's been a de jure, a legal, from the Russian perspective, recognition of what has been de facto a reality on the ground for about 7 years, which is that the Donbass regions, the two people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, have now been recognized by Russia as not being part of Ukraine, but they've been under an economic blockade by the Kiev government, and they've been, for all intents and purposes, segregated from the rest of the nation. And it took the Russians really 7-8 years to recognize the reality on the ground. So now the question is really about the borders of these political units that the Russians have recognized. And I think we'll see this question unfolding over the next days and weeks.
Anton, as I said, President Putin had a long address from the Kremlin on Monday. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
to take a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. As for those who have seized power in Kiev and are holding on to it, we demand that they stop military operations immediately. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of bloodshed will be fully on the conscience of the regime in power in Ukraine.
So, Anton, what has got us to this point, and what is Putin's game plan from here?
Well, what got us to this point is a profound disagreement, an existential disagreement between two equally valid but clashing principles. One of the sovereign rights of nations to choose their military alliances, which certainly exists. And the second one is the one that the Russians keep appealing to, which is the indivisibility of security in Europe, which is also reflected in numerous European documents, the idea that one nation or any nation should not bolster its security at the expense of another. And the Russians have seen NATO progressing towards their borders with remarkable consistency, albeit reasonably slowly, I guess you could argue, over the past 23 years. It's interesting that Tom Friedman published an article today in the New York Times reminding everyone of his famous interview with the father of American containment, George Kennan, who in 1998 predicted that the first bout of NATO expansion will not be received well by the Russians, although they were in no position to do anything about it. But he called it a fateful mistake, and he predicted very accurately, as it turned out, that the Russians will become increasingly bitter about NATO expansion towards their borders. And unfortunately, this is where we are today, and Ukraine is suffering for it.
Aaron Mattei, much has been written and said about what Putin has done. He's been roundly condemned by Western leaders for his declaration on Monday. But what about the United States and its allies? What role have they played in getting us to this point? And when I say, you know, the role they've played over the last 3 decades, since the end of the Cold War.
It's a great question that unfortunately is not explored pretty much at all in U.S. media, but it should. The short story is that there was a pledge made to the Soviet Union to agree to the reunification of Germany, that NATO, as a condition of the Soviet Union effectively dissolving, would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the promise made by James Baker. The U.S. immediately violated that. The Clinton administration oversaw a massive expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. Fast forward to 2014, and you have something you cannot talk about in U.S. media, but it's an established and very well documented fact. There was a coup in Ukraine with a heavy U.S. role. There were protests against the president at the time, Yanukovych, who, contrary to the U.S. narrative, was not pro-Russian. He was trying to play both sides, both have ties to Russia and also have ties to the West, which makes sense because Ukraine is a very divided country between people who align with Russia and people who loathe Russia and want to identify with the West. But the Obama administration was not satisfied with the prospect of essentially keeping Ukraine neutral. And so they seized upon protest against Yanukovych, put their weight behind far-right forces, which led to a coup in February 2014. The U.S. role was so extensive that Victoria Nuland, a top Obama administration official who's now back helping Biden run his Ukraine policy, was caught in a phone call plotting who would be the next Ukrainian prime minister in the government that hadn't even come in yet. And a few weeks later, Yanukovych was forced to flee and a new government was installed. And lo and behold, the prime minister who Nuland had personally selected, a guy named Yatsenyuk, became the new prime minister of Ukraine. And that basically set off this proxy war in the Donbass that's been going on for the last 8 years. And the problem from where I sit is essentially in Washington, there's been a refusal to let Ukraine be neutral. And they've instead opted to turn Ukraine into a proxy for a wider geopolitical conflict with Russia. And as we're seeing now, that's had very dangerous consequences.
The view we get in the Western media, Aaron, particularly in the United States, is that this was a totally unprovoked action on the part of Vladimir Putin, that he basically got up one morning and decided that he was going to do this to Ukraine. Does the Russian leader have good reason to be deeply suspicious of Western intentions, particularly NATO's intentions?
Again, if you look at the fact that there was a pledge not to expand NATO to Russia's borders, and then in reality, for the last 3 decades, you've had NATO consistently expanding to Russia's borders, which in itself is a threat to Russia. If by definition, a military alliance that does not allow you to enter that alliance is expanding to your borders, then by definition, you're an enemy, which means you're under threat. And then you have the fact that you had this coup in Ukraine, a change of government to install a pro-Western government inside Kiev. Then I do think Russia has grounds to be suspicious, especially since the only resolution to this crisis, which is something called the Minsk Accords, finalized by the Ukrainian, agreed to by the Ukrainian government in 2015, has been stalled. Ukraine has not been willing to implement its main provision, which calls for autonomy for the Donbas region in exchange for the demilitarization of the rebels fighting Kiev. That is the only solution on the table, but Kiev has refused to implement it because effectively that solution would take NATO membership off of the table. And the U.S., instead of pressuring its client in Kiev to implement the accords, I think has been encouraging it to ignore it, to the point where just last week, and this has not been reported pretty much anywhere, there were talks on reviving Minsk, brokered by European countries. And at those talks, the Ukrainian government refused to negotiate with the rebels, which makes a resolution impossible, because if you won't negotiate with the side you're fighting, there won't be a resolution. So given this history up until the present moment, I do think that Russia has ample reason to be suspicious of U.S. motives.
Right, and those accords that you talk about, Aaron, they would essentially give a fair degree of autonomy to these regions that are in dispute right now, and people from the region would have a say in the central government in Kiev, right?
They would, and what that would effectively mean is that Ukraine could not join NATO, because if you have a region that is autonomous like the Donbas, they effectively hold a veto over Ukraine, so over Ukraine's NATO membership. So that would put an end to this goal shared by neocons in Washington and some far-right nationalists inside Ukraine for Ukraine to join a hostile military alliance. But look, but the refusal to let go of that, I think, is what is driving this conflict. If you were to poll most Ukrainians, certainly up until the coup in 2014, most Ukrainians were not on board with NATO membership because they recognized the bind that would put the country in. Having a hostile military alliance on Russia's border, especially in a country where so many people have ties to Russia, family ties, they speak Russian. It's a very dangerous recipe, but a refusal to let go of that goal is, I think, leading to a very, very perilous moment.
Anton, looking at the actions that have been taken against Russia, the United States announced sanctions on Tuesday afternoon. But before that, the Europeans announced sanctions, and Germany announced its sanctions as well. Germany, of course, is a big trade partner with Russia and imports energy from Russia. In fact, it's the biggest buyer of Russian gas. Here's Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Let's listen to him.
The Russian president's decision to recognize the so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk on Monday is a serious violation of international law. By doing so, President Putin does not just violate the Minsk agreement, which he himself signed in 2014 and 15. He also does away with the basic principles as outlined in the United Nations Charter on the peaceful coexistence of peoples.
So, Anton, what's at stake for Germany?
Well, for Germany, it's the energy question that is at stake. It's too early to tell how far the sanctions will go, because now that depends on what the Russians do in the next days or weeks, whether there is more military escalation in southeast Ukraine. But I will say this, I was surprised by how soft the sanctions were today, both from the European Union and from Great Britain and even from the United States. I have this feeling, and again, this is just a guess because I don't know what was going on behind the closed doors during the negotiations, but I have a feeling that the Germans agreed to suspend, and note, suspend, not cancel the ratification the certification, pardon me, of Nord Stream 2 in exchange for fairly manageable and soft sanctions against the Russians. They will have no effect, I think, on Putin's decisions, because for the Kremlin, this is an existential question that has to do with fundamental issues of security. sanctions that have been imposed before have not worked. A whole bunch of banks that were mentioned today, both by the United States and by Britain and by the EU, are either already under sanctions or they are Russian banks that do not operate actively on foreign markets. There have been names named of people to be sanctioned from Putin's close circle. Timchenko, the Rotenberg brothers, they are already under sanctions, so this will be just a ratcheting up of what was already there. And given that the West has been telegraphing exactly what it will do and the areas it will target over the past years, and especially over the past couple of months, the Russians have taken their time to prepare for this. And what we saw today was a shot across the bow. I have no doubt that if the situation becomes more serious around the Donbass, that so will the sanctions. But so far, this is by no means a deterrent. As a matter of fact, I would say that the cancellation by Blinken of his meeting with Lavrov, which I saw just before we went on air, and I'm assuming is an accurate report, that is a more serious step on the part of the West and a step away from diplomacy at this point.
So, Anton, these sanctions, as you say, were relatively light sanctions. Why? Because we've been led to believe for the past few days and weeks that the United States and its allies were going to impose very heavy sanctions on Russia.
Yes, we were led to believe that that would happen, of course, in case of a massive Russian invasion, which has not materialized yet. I'm sure that if it were to materialize, the more draconian sanctions would be imposed. But I think there's also plenty of disagreement about which we don't hear in the Western media, but also because the Europeans and the Americans don't want the nature of their behind closed doors conversations revealed, but there's plenty of disagreement among the Europeans about the extent to which they will sanction Russia. It's worth remembering that over the past 2.5 weeks, literally, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity, especially on the part of the Germans and the French. And I have a feeling that, again, behind closed doors, they were putting enormous pressure on President Zelensky to actually begin to carry out the Minsk II agreements to which Aaron had been referring a second ago. And they were met with refusals from the Ukrainians. And so the Europeans understand that they do need to, they want to put up a united front against Russia. But there's also plenty of disagreement, again, which I doubt we will hear aired in public, about the distribution of responsibility for bringing all of Europe to the crisis we're witnessing right now.
Okay, I'm going to get back to the Minsk Accords in a moment, but first we need to take a break. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the US reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN. To know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Let's get back to our panel. And joining us now is Ulrich Bruckner. He's a European Studies professor at Stanford University in Berlin. And of course, we are also rejoined by Aaron Mattei and Anton Fedyashin. Ulrich Bruckner, let me get to you first. As I said at the beginning of the show, a lot has happened over the past 24 hours. In fact, we had one of the first responses to President Putin's declaration from Germany when it announced sanctions against Russia. What do you make of what has happened?
Well, what we hear and what has been expected for a long time is that Nord Stream 2 is basically dead. What the Minister of Economic Affairs announced is that he will have a second look into the certification process. But politically, it was absolutely clear that given the situation since December, basically, there is no chance to go back to normal and to just think that this is a private investment and it could help Germany to do things unilaterally while everyone else is scared by the increasing energy dependency on Russia.
Is it dead, Ulrich, or would it become part of the negotiations in the future?
Well, technically, it hasn't started yet, and practically, it isn't dead because it can always open if it is a bargain chip.
Right.
I was surprised 2 weeks ago when a Russian commentator brought it up that this could actually be something that Putin wants to get away with. But now that we see that it's far more a geopolitical and a historical removal of borders in Europe, I don't think that something as little as a pipeline could be the price that Putin wants to walk away with.
But we could see gas prices rise sharply in Europe. I mean, could this hurt Chancellor Scholz domestically?
I don't think so, because everyone understands that the root cause of the rising gas prices has been Russia, and the current gas price rise today is also directly triggered by Russia. What we also see is that a few other countries have been wiser and they fill their gas tanks, and now they understand that they don't need it, and they flood the market with gas that they don't need for the ending winter season. And so there is also an ease of the gas price before yesterday, and we slowly continue to fill our storages, and this leverage is not working, at least not for this winter season.
Aaron Matta, I want to get back to the Minsk Accords that you were telling us about earlier on. Is that now dead, or does it remain a pathway to some kind of diplomatic way out of this?
Just on the point quickly about Germany and Nord Stream 2, I'm not so sure I would assume that Germans will support the shutdown of the Nord Stream 2. And I think an indication of that was the Chancellor's refusal, even when he was standing next to Joe Biden just a few weeks ago, to pledge to cancel Nord Stream 2, even as Biden was saying, if Russia invades, we will cancel Nord Stream 2. And the Chancellor refused to commit to that, despite heavy pressure from the U.S. And I suspect, I mean, I don't know the internal dynamics of Germany too well, that that's a reflection that he might be fearful of the domestic consequences if he goes along with the U.S., because there is at least the threat of higher gas prices and people not having sufficient heat during wintertime if energy flows stop coming from Russia. Now, granted, there are still ways for Russian energy to get to Germany and the rest of Europe without Nord Stream 2, and those actually are still ongoing, including via Ukraine, by the way. But I suspect that there's more of a split, at least inside the German government, than they've let on, and I think that is reflected in the fact that the Chancellor had to be dragged into even suspending Nord Stream 2. As for Minsk, I don't think, certainly I think Russia making this decision to recognize the breakaway republics, that to me is a signal from them that they believe that Minsk is hopeless. This is a 7-year-long negotiating process. Clearly, the U.S. was not putting any pressure at all on Kiev to implement them. And also, we also can't discount the very real influence of far-right forces inside Ukraine. Back when Zelensky was elected, recall, he was elected on a platform of peace. He was going to implement Minsk and actually end the fighting. He saw heavy protests from far-right forces inside Ukraine, essentially threatening him with another Maidan coup if he went along with Minsk. And I think that the fear of that, on top of an absence of U.S. pressure, has been keeping Zelensky from implementing Minsk, but who knows? Dynamics could change, and if there's a countervailing force inside Ukraine against the far-right forces, perhaps Zelensky will be more willing to enter into the terms that his government already agreed to 7 years ago.
Anton Fedyashin, one of the other consequences of these tensions between Russia and the West is that we've seen the ties between Russia and China improve and get a lot closer. They recently signed a joint declaration in Beijing. That's when President Putin was in Beijing. He initially went there for the opening of the Beijing Olympics and then had a meeting with President Xi Jinping. This is the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Let's listen to what he had to say.
冷战早已经结束了。
Since the Cold War is long gone, NATO, a product of the Cold War, needs to adapt itself to the changing circumstances. If NATO keeps expanding eastward, will this be conducive to peace and stability in Europe? And will this contribute to long-term stability in Europe? This is a question that merits serious consideration by European friends.
What do you make of the improving relationship between Russia and China, Anton?
I think it was inevitable, especially after 2014. Remember that the Russians had been trying to make their own pivot to Asia, very much like the Obama administration, for several years before 2014, and not much was happening in that direction. But the coup in Ukraine, then the disastrous unraveling of the Russia-Western relationship, the sanctions, really sort of galvanized the entire process. We've talked about this on many occasions on your program. And this is why one of the loudest voices of criticism of successive American administrations' policies towards Ukraine and Russia has been Henry Kissinger, of all people, because towards the end of his life, he is seeing the work that he and Nixon had done in the very early 70s unravel before his eyes. They had made Washington closer to Beijing than Beijing was to Moscow, and now the entire relationship within that strategic triangle is being reversed, and the Russians and the Chinese are growing closer together. So far, it's an alliance of convenience. It's not really an alliance, but there is an emerging understanding that the world order has changed, that the America's unipolar moment and the West's unipolar moment is over, and that new actors are rising. And the Chinese have been remarkably neutral in what's going on, not supporting the Russians, not even recognizing the annexation of Crimea, and yet not condemning them.
Okay, very quickly, Ulrich, the Wall Street Journal had a story in which they said that what Putin is doing here goes beyond actually anything just involving Ukraine, that he wants to renegotiate the end of the Cold War. Is Europe prepared to renegotiate that, to rework the security arrangements that were put in place at the end of the Cold War?
Well, first of all, we have very different worldviews, and Europe has gone far from thinking in terms of territory. Territory in times of globalization is something that became so irrelevant that it's not something to start a war over. And we don't think in categories like, let's redraw borders in the style of the 20th century. This is not what people think in Europe. That is also why no one's prepared for it.
Okay, Ulrich, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.